The ink on their marriage certificate was barely dry when Nathaniel left Josephine standing alone in the cold, cavernous hallway of his ancestral home. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The muffled melodic laughter drifting down from the east wing told her exactly whose bed he was warming on their wedding night. A lesser woman might have wept. A foolish woman might have screamed. Josephine did neither. She calmly unpinned her veil, ordered a pot of black tea, and went to work. The carriage ride to Ashbourne Manor had taken 4 hours. For 3.5 of them, Nathaniel had pretended to sleep. Josephine sat opposite him, her back perfectly straight against the tufted leather cushions. She watched the grey countryside roll past through the rain-streaked glass. She did not attempt conversation. She had learned early in their brief courtship that Nathaniel considered her words a nuisance, a tedious tax he had to pay to access her family's considerable fortune. He was old money land rich and cash poor. She was new money, the daughter of a ruthless industrialist. It was a merger. She had no illusions about love. Still, a wedding day was supposed to hold a shred of dignity. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt on the gravel drive, Nathaniel's eyes snapped open. He didn't look at her. He pushed the heavy oak door open before the footman could reach it. Stepping out into the damp evening air, he offered no hand to help her down. Josephine gathered her heavy silk skirts yards of fabric that felt more like a shroud than a celebration and climbed down unassisted. The staff was lined up in the foyer. They stood at attention, their eyes darting between the sullen master of the house and the stoic new mistress. "Show her to the blue room," Nathaniel muttered to a nervous-looking housekeeper. He didn't look back. He simply turned on his heel, his heavy boots echoing sharply against the marble floor as he walked away. He headed up the grand staircase and took a sharp left toward the east wing. Josephine stood perfectly still. The silence in the foyer was absolute, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. The staff held their collective breath. They knew where the master was going. They all knew who lived in the east wing. Mom, the housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Higgins, stepped forward. Her voice was laced with pity. It was an offensive sound. "Just Josephine will do for now, Mrs. Higgins," she said, her voice even. "Lead the way." The blue room was vast, draughty, and smelled faintly of lavender and disuse. The bed was a towering mahogany monstrosity. Mrs. Higgins hovered near the door, wringing her hands in her apron. "Shall I send up a tram some broth? Or perhaps you'd like me to fetch your lady's maid to help you undress?" "My maid will not be joining me until tomorrow," Josephine said. She walked over to the vanity mirror. She looked at herself, the pale face, the tight corset, the ridiculous mountain of pins in her hair. "You may help me with the laces, Mrs. Higgins. Then you may bring me the household ledgers and the master ring of keys." Mrs. Higgins blinked. "The ledgers, Mom. Tonight?" "Yes, tonight." As the housekeeper fumbled with the tight silk laces of the wedding gown, a sound drifted through the thick walls. A woman's laugh, high, breathless, and unmistakable. It was followed by the low rumble of Nathaniel's voice. Mrs. Higgins froze, her fingers trembling against Josephine's spine. "I am so sorry, ma'am." "The master heap," breathed Mrs. Higgins, Josephine commanded softly. The laces freed from the suffocating dress. Josephine slipped into a thick dark wool robe. It was entirely unromantic. It was armor. She sat at the small writing desk near the fireplace. 10 minutes later, a bewildered Mrs. Higgins returned carrying a stack of leather-bound books and a heavy iron ring laden with brass keys. "Set them down." Josephine did not cry. She did not pace the floor. She opened the first ledger. The numbers told a story much clearer than any whispered gossip. Ashbourne Manor was bleeding out. The estate was hemorrhaging money on imported wines, custom-tailored clothes, and a shocking allowance paid out to a Miss Charlotte Vane. The Mistress Josephine traced the ink with her fingertip. Nathaniel was a fool. He had sold his freedom to her father to save his estate, but he was still spending like a king. He thought he could take her money, humiliate her on her wedding night, and carry on as before. He thought she was a fragile society girl who would hide in her room and weep into her embroidered handkerchiefs out of shame. Josephine picked up the heavy ring of keys. They jingled sharply in the quiet room. Power in a household like this did not reside in the master's bed. It resided here in the pantries, the wine cellars, the accounts, the coal stores. She opened the door. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by a few flickering gas sconces. She walked quietly down the corridor, her soft slippers making no sound on the runner rug. She didn't go to the east wing. She went down to the servants' quarters. She found the head cook, the butler, and Mrs. Higgins sitting around a worn pine table, drinking tea and undoubtedly whispering about the disastrous bride. Jumped to their feet when she entered. "Sit down," Josephine said. She placed the heavy ring of keys on the center of the table with a definitive thud. "Tomorrow morning, breakfast will be served at precisely 7. I will review all vendor accounts at 8. The locks on the wine cellar and the silver pantry are to be changed by noon. No one, and I mean no, draws a single penny from the household accounts without my written signature. Is that understood?" The butler, a gay-haired man who had served the family for 30 years, swallowed hard. "But Mom, the master usually." "The master sold this estate to my father 3 weeks ago to cover his gambling debts," Josephine stated coldly, stating the brutal, unspoken truth aloud. "I am not a guest in this house. I am the proprietor. Good night." She turned and walked back up the stairs. The muffled laughter from the east wing had stopped. Josephine smiled in the dark. Let them sleep. Tomorrow they would wake up in her world. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the sprawling lawns of Ashbourne Manor looking bruised and muddy. Josephine was awake before the sun broke the horizon. She did not look tired. She dressed herself in a tailored day dress of slate grey wool, high collar, tight sleeves, zero frills. She looked less like a newlywed and more like a bank manager. She descended the grand staircase exactly at 6:45. The house was already humming with nervous energy. Her midnight visit to the kitchens had done its job. The staff moved with a frantic, terrified efficiency she hadn't seen the day before. The breakfast room was vast, dominated by a long mahogany table that could seat 20. Josephine sat at the head, not the side, the head. At exactly 7, the heavy oak doors swung open. Nathaniel strode in. He was dressed in a velvet smoking jacket, looking slightly rumpled, a portrait of careless aristocratic entitlement. He paused when he saw her sitting in his chair. A flicker of annoyance crossed his handsome features, quickly replaced by a smug, defensive smirk. He was bracing for the tears. He was ready for the accusations, the hysterical sobbing, the demands for an explanation. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the silver sideboard and took a seat halfway down the table. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. The question was a barb, a deliberate provocation. Josephine didn't look up from the open ledger beside her plate. She made a neat notation with her fountain pen adequately. "The mattress in the blue room requires turning, and the chimney needs sweeping. I have already instructed the footman to handle it." Nathaniel frowned. He set his cup down, the porcelain clinking sharply against the saucer. "You're reading accounts on our first morning." "Someone has to," she replied smoothly, turning a page. "I see you've been paying 3 shillings a pound for venison from the Miller farm. You're being robbed. I've sent a boy to cancel the standing order. We will source it from my father's tenants in Yorkshire moving forward." Nathaniel stared at her. His script was ruined. She wasn't playing the victim. "You cancelled my meat order. I am stopping the bleeding," Josephine corrected, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was as hard as flint. "You are functionally bankrupt, Nathaniel. I spent the night untangling the absolute mess you call bookkeeping." Before he could muster a response to this indignity, the door swung open again. Charlotte Vane entered. She was a beautiful woman, all golden curls and soft, pouting lips. She wore a silk dressing gown that clung to her curves, a garment entirely inappropriate for the breakfast room. She drifted in with an air of absolute ownership. her eyes locking onto Josephine with a predatory gleam. This was the mistress coming to inspect the interloper. She wanted to assert her dominance to show the plain bride exactly who truly held Nathaniel's favor. "Oh, I didn't realize we had company so early," Charlotte purred, trailing a hand over Nathaniel's shoulder as she passed him. She didn't sit. She stood near the table, waiting for the explosion. Josephine set her pen down. She folded her hands on top of the ledger. She looked at Charlotte. She didn't look at her with hatred or jealousy or even anger. She looked at her way one might look at a stain on a good rug. "You must be Miss Vane," Josephine said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10. Charlotte smiled a wicked triumphant thing. "I am. Nathaniel and I are very close friends." She looked at Nathaniel, expecting him to defend her to put his new wife in her place. Nathaniel cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The cold, sterile reality of the breakfast room was drastically different from the dark, intimate promises of the East Wing. "Charlotte is a long-time resident here. She is a line item." Josephine interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. Silence fell over the room. Charlotte's smile vanished. Josephine tapped the open book. "I see a monthly allowance. I see bills from dressmakers in London. I see charges for imported French perfumes." She closed the ledger with a heavy thud. "I assume you are aware, Miss Vane, that as of yesterday afternoon, all financial assets of this estate transferred to my name." Charlotte's face flushed red. She looked at Nathaniel. "Nate, what is she talking about?" Nathaniel looked away, staring stubbornly at his coffee cup. "He didn't tell you?" Josephine asked, feigning mild surprise. "How unfortunate." "Nathaniel's debts were entirely assumed by my family. In exchange, the deed to Ashbourne Manor, along with all its contents, belongs to me, which means, Miss Vane, that I am currently paying for the silk wrapper you are wearing." "You little," Charlotte snarled, stepping forward, her hands balling into fists. "I suggest you pack." Josephine continued her tone, conversational, completely ignoring the woman's rising fury. "The carriage will be ready to take you to the train station at noon. I have instructed the butler to give you £50 as severance. It is a generous sum. It will more than cover your ticket back to London and a week at a respectable boarding house." "Severance?" Charlotte shrieked. "I am not a servant, Nathaniel. Tell her." Nathaniel finally looked up, his face pale. "Josephine, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "There is nothing to discuss," Josephine said, standing up. She smoothed the front of her skirt. She was not tall, but at that moment she cast a massive shadow. "I am running a household, not a charity for my husband's past mistakes. Noon, Miss Vane. If you are not out of my house by then, I will have the groundskeeper physically remove you." She turned her back on them both, walking toward the door. "You can't do this." Charlotte screamed after her, her voice cracking with panic. "He loves me. He was with me last night." Josephine paused with her hand on the brass doorknob. She didn't turn around. "He can be with you every night, Miss Vane," Josephine said quietly, "as long as it isn't under my roof, and as long as it isn't on my dime. Have a pleasant journey." She closed the door behind her, leaving them in the deafening silence of their own ruin. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with the heavy rhythmic finality of an executioner's drum. It was 11:45. Charlotte did not leave quietly. The East Wing became a war zone of shattered glass and hysterical sobbing. From her newly claimed office on the ground floor, Josephine could hear the crash of something heavy, likely a porcelain wash basin smashing against the floorboards. Then came the high-pitched screaming. Charlotte was demanding to see Nathaniel. She was demanding a carriage back to London, no to Paris. She was demanding her dignity, a commodity she had surrendered years ago for a warm bed and a silk wardrobe. Josephine sat at the heavy mahogany desk that had belonged to Nathaniel's grandfather. She ignored the noise upstairs. She was currently deep in a conversation with the estate manager, a weathered, suspicious man named Thomas Croft. Croft had entered the room 10 minutes prior, expecting to plate a weeping bride. Instead, he found a woman systematically dismantling the estate's agricultural contracts with a red ink pen. The wheat yields from the southern acreage are down 20%, Josephine said, keeping her eyes on the ledger. Yet the transport costs to the mill have doubled. Explain this to me, Mr. Croft. Croft shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other. Well, ma'am, the old carts broke down last harvest. The master, Mr. Nathaniel, that is, he hired out the hauling to a private firm in the village. A friend of his, a friend who is overcharging us by 50%. Josephine drew a sharp red line through the expense, cancel the contract, buy 2 new carts, hire local hands to drive them. We will own our labor, not rent it from my husband's drinking companions. A massive thud echoed from the ceiling above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy trunk being dragged across the landing. Croft winced, glancing upward. Mom, should I perhaps intervene? Let the staff handle it. Josephine replied calmly. They are being paid to do a job. You are being paid to ensure this land turns a profit. Let us focus on our respective tasks. At precisely noon, the crunch of carriage wheels sounded on the gravel drive. Josephine did not go to the window. She kept writing. She heard the heavy front doors open, the muffled, tear-choked insults hurled by Charlotte, and the sharp professional voice of the butler ordering the footman to load the luggage, and Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen. He had locked himself in the billiards room with a bottle of brandy the moment Josephine had issued her ultimatum. He was a man who preferred to hide from the storms he created. When the carriage finally pulled away, taking the mistress and her silk wrappers down the long oak-lined driveway, a profound silence fell over Ashbourne Manor. The air in the house seemed to physically lighten. The poison had been drawn. 10 minutes later, the door to Josephine's office slammed open. Nathaniel stood in the threshold. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw tight, with a fury that looked incredibly fragile. He smelled of cheap tobacco and expensive liquor. She's gone, he sneered, gripping the door frame. Are you satisfied? Is your pride intact? Josephine finished the sentence she was writing, dotted the period with deliberate care, and set her pen down. She looked up at him. My pride was never the issue, Nathaniel. The estate's solvency was. I simply removed an unauthorized expense. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, slamming his hands down on the desk, leaning over her. He wanted her to shrink back. He wanted her to show fear. You humiliated me in front of my own staff. He hissed, his voice trembling with rage. You treat me like a child in my own home. I am your husband. I demand respect. Josephine did not flinch. She leaned back in her leather chair, surveying him with cold clinical detachment. Respect is earned, Nathaniel, not demanded by virtue of a ring you paid for with my father's money. Her voice was quiet, lacking any of the heat he was projecting. That made it worse for him. It made him feel small. You slept with another woman down the hall from me while I was taking off my wedding dress. You forfeited your right to my respect before the ink on our marriage lines was dry. It was an arrangement, he shouted, slapping the desk. You knew what this was. Your father bought a title for his little girl. I bought a lifeline. Nobody mentioned love. I never asked for love. Josephine fired back, her voice, finally rising sharp and biting as a winter wind. I asked for a partnership. I asked for the basic fundamental dignity of a business transaction. You couldn't even manage that. You took my money and expected me to sit quietly while you flaunted your in my face. Nathaniel recoiled as if she had slapped him. The crude words spoken in her refined, educated accent shocked him. You wanted to play the lord of the manor without doing the work. Josephine continued, standing up. She was shorter than him, but she commanded the room. Well, the game is over. The debts are paid. The mistress is gone. The ledgers are mine. You can either make yourself useful and help me pull this estate out of the mud, or you can stay out of my way. But do not ever walk into my office and demand respect you have not earned. She picked up her pen again. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 3 years of neglected tax records to audit. Nathaniel stared at her. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to assert some final measure of dominance, but there were no words left. The bluster drained out of him. He turned and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Autumn hit the countryside with brutal efficiency, stripping the leaves from the oaks and turning the ground iron-hard with morning frost. Inside Ashbourne Manor, the season of repair had begun. For the first time in a decade, the estate smelled of something other than dust and decay. It smelled of raw pine, wet plaster and beeswax. Josephine had hired teams of local labourers. Masons repointed the crumbling brickwork on the chimneys. Carpenters replaced the rotted floorboards in the west wing. The deafening sound of hammers and saws echoed through the halls from dawn until dusk. Josephine was everywhere. She walked the scaffolding in her heavy woolen skirts, inspecting the slate on the roof. She stood in the freezing mud of the stableyard, negotiating the price of winter oats for the horses. She ate her meals alone in the study, a piece of cold toast in one hand and a stack of invoices in the other. She was exhausted. Her bones ached from the damp cold, and her eyes burned from the dim oil lamps she read by late into the night. She was entirely alone in a house of 40 rooms, surrounded by people she paid to listen to her. There were nights long after the staff had gone to bed when she would stand by the window in her dark bedroom, looking out at the frost-covered lawns and let a single ragged breath escape her lungs. She had won the war, but the victory felt remarkably like solitary confinement. Nathaniel, conversely, was a ghost in his own home. His life had shrunk down to the size of a postage stamp. Josephine had not cut off his funds completely. That would have caused a public scandal she didn't have time to manage, but she had placed him on a strict, humiliatingly meagre allowance. It was enough to buy his tobacco and perhaps a few pints at the local tavern, but nothing more. His London friends, the men who used to travel up for weeks of hunting and drinking at his expense, had stopped answering his letters. Word had spread through their exclusive clubs that Nathaniel's purse strings had been severed. Without his money, his charm was utterly worthless. By November, the isolation began to break him. The quiet hostility he had harbored since Charlotte's departure slowly morphed into a desperate, gnawing loneliness. He began to watch his wife. He watched her command the room when the tenant farmers came to pay their rents. He watched the way her jaw set when she was calculating numbers. He noticed for the first time the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, the elegant slope of her neck when she bent over her papers. Stripped of his mistress and his sycophants, he was finally forced to look at the woman he had married. One evening in late November, the first heavy snow began to fall. Josephine was in the library, a fire blazing in the hearth, a heavy blanket draped over her lap. She was reviewing the blueprints for a new drainage system in the lower fields. The door clicked open. Nathaniel walked in. He wasn't carrying his usual glass of sullen whiskey. He was carrying a silver tray with a pot of tea and 2 cups. Josephine looked up her pen, pausing over the paper. She didn't say anything. He set the tray down on the small table next to her armchair. "Mrs. Higgins said you hadn't eaten since noon," he said softly. His voice lacked the arrogant edge she was accustomed to. It sounded hesitant, rough. "I lost track of time," she replied cautiously. She watched him pour the tea. His hands were steady, but the gesture was so domestic, so alien to his nature, it felt like a trap. He handed her a cup. She took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. He didn't pull away immediately. He let his hand hover in the space between them. "The roof in the west wing didn't leak today," he offered, pulling a chair up closer to the fire. "First time in 5 years. The new slate is holding," Josephine agreed, taking a sip. The tea was hot and sweet. "The real test will be the spring-thaw silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unsaid things." The only sound was the crackle of the logs in the fireplace, and the soft hiss of the snow hitting the window panes. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at her, really looked at her. "I was a fool, Josephine." She stopped drinking. She set the teacup down on its saucer with a soft clink. She didn't look at him. She looked at the fire. Yes, you were. I thought he swallowed hard, struggling to find words that didn't sound pathetic. I thought you were just a girl from the city. I thought I could ignore you. I didn't realize who you were, what you were capable of. And now, she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Now I see you, he said, reaching out. He laid his hand gently over hers on the armrest. It was a practiced move, a lover's move. I see a woman who saved my home. I see a woman who is brilliant and strong and beautiful. I want to try, Josephine. I want to be a real husband to you. Josephine looked down at his hand resting on hers. It was a handsome hand, soft, uncalloused by work. It was the hand of a man who knew exactly how to make a woman feel wanted simply by touching her in the dark. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled her hand away. Nathaniel's face fell. Do not insult my intelligence, Nathaniel, she said, her tone devoid of anger, which somehow made it colder. You do not see a beautiful woman. You see a locked vault, and you are trying to figure out the combination. That's not true, he protested, his cheeks flushing. I am trying to make amends. You are bored, she corrected him. You are lonely. Your friends have abandoned you because you can no longer buy their loyalty, and your mistress is gone because I refuse to pay for her. I am the only person left in this house for you to charm. You are looking for a warm bed and a larger allowance. Josephine, please. No. She picked up her pen again. I told you on the first day I wanted a partnership. Partners build things together. They bleed together. I have spent the last 3 months bleeding to keep a roof over our heads while you sulk in the billiards room. You want to be my husband. She pointed the pen at him like a weapon. Earn it. Go out to the stables tomorrow at 600 in the morning and help Mr. Croft shovel out the stalls. Ride out to the frozen fields and help the men break the ice in the irrigation ditches. Sweat for this land. Care for it. She looked back down at her blueprints. Until then, Nathaniel, do not touch me and do not pour my tea. The grandfather clock chimed 600 in the morning. Outside, the world was pitch black and frozen solid. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, leaving a thick layer of rime ice on the inside of the window panes. Nathaniel stood at the foot of his bed, staring at his boots. They were fine leather riding boots custom-made by a cobbler in London. They were not made for mucking out stalls. He felt a deep, humiliating ache in his chest. His wife had dismissed him with the casual authority of a board school teacher. She had looked at his hands untouched by anything heavier than a fountain pen or a crystal tumbler and found him utterly lacking. He could stay inside. He could order breakfast, sit by the fire, and let the resentment fester. It was his right. He was the master of Ashbourne. But the house was silent, and the silence was suffocating. His pride, battered and bruised, demanded something else. It demanded proof. He pulled the boots on. He found a heavy wool coat in the back of his arm wire, an ugly, durable thing left behind by his late father. He walked downstairs past the startled night-maid and pushed out the kitchen door into the biting cold. The stableyard was a brutal place at dawn. The smell of manure, wet hay and ammonia hung thick in the frozen air. Thomas Croft and a young stablehand named Miller were already there, their breath pluming in the lantern light as they dragged heavy pitchforks through the muck. They stopped when Nathaniel walked in. Miller practically dropped his pitchfork. Croft simply narrowed his eyes, his weathered face entirely unreadable. I am here to work, Mr. Croft. Nathaniel said. His voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the cavernous barn. Croft spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt. Didn't say sir. He didn't bow. He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward a line of uncleaned stalls at the back. Take the wheelbarrow. Clear the soiled straw. Don't frighten the mares. The next 4 hours were the longest of Nathaniel's life. The physical labor was staggering. The pitchfork was heavy. The wet straw was dense, and the smell made his stomach turn. Within 30 minutes, the skin on his palms began to tear. Blisters formed, popped, and bled into the rough wooden handle of the fork. His shoulders burned, his lungs atched from the freezing air. Croft did not offer advice. He did not offer breaks. He simply watched fully, expecting the lord of the manor to throw down the tool and retreat to his brandy. Nathaniel didn't throw it down. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stop, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Josephine's cold, assessing stare. You want to be my husband? Earn it. He kept digging. By noon, he was covered in sweat, dirt, and horse manure. He limped back to the house, entered through the servants' door, and washed his bleeding hands at the scullery sink. Mrs. Higgins offered him a bowl of stew in the kitchen. He ate it standing up, too exhausted to speak. The next morning, his body was so stiff he could barely sit up. He went back to the stables anyway. A week passed, then two. The blisters on his hands hardened into thick yellow calluses. The velvet smoking jackets remained in his closet. He lived in rough wool and canvas. He learned how to break the ice in the troughs without cracking the wood. He learned how to pack mud into the drafts of the lambing sheds. He stopped talking entirely. He had nothing to say that the dirt couldn't answer. Josephine watched him. She never acknowledged him in the yard, but from her office window she saw the transformation. She watched the way he began to hold his shoulders, losing the arrogant slouch of a gentleman and adopting the weary, grounded stance of a laborer. She saw him help Miller lift a heavy sack of oats, taking the brunt of the weight without complaint. She did not soften, not yet. A few weeks of manual labor did not erase a betrayal, but the absolute disgust she had felt for him began to fade, replaced by a cautious clinical curiosity. In late January, a massive blizzard slammed into the valley. The wind howled like a dying animal, piling snow drifts waist high against the manor walls. Josephine stayed in her office, pacing the floorboards, listening to the heavy timber of the roof groan under the weight of the snow. At 3:00 in the afternoon, the heavy front doors burst open. Nathaniel stood in the foyer. He was covered head to toe in white, his face flushed red from the wind. He was breathing heavily, holding a thick coil of hemp rope. The roof on the main grain store is bowing, he said, his voice loud over the shrieking wind. If it caves, we lose half the winter feed. I need the key to the equipment shed. Croft and I are going up to shovel it off. Josephine stepped out of her office. It's a whiteout. You can't go up on a slate roof in this wind. It's suicide. If we lose the grain, the herd starves by March. He shot back, wiping melting snow from his eyes. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a fact. She stared at him. There was no bluster in his eyes. No performance. Just the grim, desperate math of survival. He cared. He actually cared about the estate. She unclipped the iron ring from her belt, sorted through the heavy brass keys and detached the one for the equipment shed. She walked over and pressed it into his raw, scarred hand. Tie the rope around the main chimney, she ordered, her voice tight. Do not step on the southern slope. The joists there are rotting. He closed his fist around the key. I know. I saw them yesterday. He held her gaze for a single heavy second. Then he turned and walked back out into the storm. Josephine stood in the cold foyer for a long time, listening to the wind, suddenly terrified that he wouldn't come back. The roof held. Nathaniel and Croft spent 6 hours in the blinding snow, shoveling literal tons of weight off the structure. When Nathaniel finally returned to the manor long past dark, he was shivering so violently he couldn't unbutton his own coat. Josephine had ordered a copper tub filled with boiling water dragged into his bedroom. She did not stay to help him bathe, but she left a bottle of his favorite brandy on the washstand. When she checked the ledger the next morning, the bottle remained unopened. By March, the brutal freeze broke. The estate turned into a sprawling ocean of brown, sticky mud. Green shoots of winter wheat began to push through the soil. The tension inside Ashbourne Manor had shifted. It was no longer a battleground. It was a ceasefire. Nathaniel and Josephine now ate dinner together. They did not speak of the wedding night. They spoke of crop rotations, timber yields, and property taxes. They were two generals discussing a campaign over maps. Nathaniel knew the land. He knew which fields flooded and which held the frost. Josephine knew the numbers. She knew exactly how much fertilizer they could afford based on the projected grain prices. They were becoming a formidable machine. In early April, a letter arrived from the district magistrate. The coal contracts for the region were being renegotiated in the nearby town of Oak Haven. It was a critical meeting. The estate relied on a steady, cheap supply of coal to heat the manor and power the small steam mill on the river. I will take the carriage into town on Thursday. Josephine announced at breakfast, folding the heavy parchment. Mr. Caldwell holds the monopoly on the northern mines. I need to look him in the eye before I sign a 3-year lock. Nathaniel sat down his coffee. He was leaner now, the soft flesh of his privileged youth burned away by the winter. Caldwell is a snake. He despises women in business, and he resents your father's new money. He will try to bleed you. Let him try, Josephine replied flatly. Math has no gender. I'm going with you, Nathaniel said. Josephine paused. She looked at him carefully. I do not need a chaperone, Nathaniel, nor do I need you to play the protective husband to save my sensibilities. I'm not going to protect your sensibilities, he countered smoothly. I'm going to protect our margins. Caldwell is old guard. He respects bloodlines. He will try to ignore you. If I am sitting next to you forcing him to address the table, it ruins his game. It was a tactical, cold-blooded assessment. Josephine couldn't fault the logic. Fine, we leave at dawn. The meeting took place in the smoky oak-paneled back room of the Oak Haven Gentlemen's Club. Josephine was the only woman in the building. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of roasted meats. Mr. Caldwell, a wide-fried man with mutton chop whiskers, sat behind a massive desk. He smiled greasily when they entered, but his eyes were hard. Lord Ashbourne, Caldwell boomed, standing up to shake Nathaniel's hand. He barely glanced at Josephine, and the new bride, how quaint. I have the standard contracts drawn up, Nathaniel. A slight increase in price per ton, standard market fluctuations. You understand, just sign at the bottom and we'll have a brandy. He slid the papers across the desk, pushing them deliberately toward Nathaniel. Nathaniel didn't pick up the pen. He didn't even look at the contract. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing one leg over the other. I don't handle the vendor negotiations. Caldwell. Nathaniel said, his voice dripping with bored aristocratic nonchalance. My wife manages the accounts. Address her. Caldwell's smile slipped. He looked at Josephine, his lip curling in a faint sneer. Madam, this is a matter of industrial tonnage, not household groceries. Perhaps it is best left to the men. Josephine pulled a leather-bound notebook from her satchel. She opened it, uncapped her pen, and looked directly into Caldwell's eyes. Your slight increase is 14%, Mr. Caldwell. Josephine stayed, her voice slicing through the smoky room like a scalpel. The national market fluctuation for raw coal over the last quarter was 3.2%. You are attempting to charge us an 11% premium to line your own pockets. Assuming my husband would be too inattentive to check the math, Caldwell turned red. He slammed a heavy fist on the desk. Listen here, little girl. I have supplied Ashbourne for 20 years. And you have been overcharging Ashbourne for 10 of them. Josephine interrupted, tapping her notebook. I have the old ledgers. Now here is my counteroffer. We will lock in a 3-year contract at last year's price minus 2% for bulk delivery. Absolutely not, Caldwell roared. I will cut off your supply, let you freeze in that massive tomb of a house. If you refuse, Josephine continued seamlessly, we will buy our coal from the Welsh mining syndicate. The transport fees are higher, yes, but my father owns a controlling share in the rail line that services this county. He will waive the freight charges for his daughter. We will get our coal cheaper than you can dig it out of the ground. She closed the notebook with a sharp snap. And I will personally ensure every estate manager in this district knows exactly how easily you can be bypassed. The room went dead silent. Caldwell stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He looked desperately at Nathaniel. Ashbourne, you cannot let your wife threaten a gentleman in this manner. Nathaniel leaned forward. The bored aristocrat vanished, replaced by the man who had shoveled snow in a whiteout to save his livestock. His eyes were dark and predatory. "My wife did not threaten you." "Caldwell," Nathaniel said softly, his voice carrying a lethal weight. "She stated a financial reality. Sign the contract at her price, or we walk out that door and she bankrupts you by Christmas. Choose." Caldwell looked between the two of them. He saw no bluff in Josephine's eyes and no mercy in Nathaniel's. Trembling slightly with rage, he snatched the pen from the inkwell and slashed his signature across the revised terms. The carriage ride back to the manor was quiet. The adrenaline of the confrontation was slowly draining away, leaving a strange, vibrating energy in the small, enclosed space. Josephine looked out the window at the passing fields. "You didn't have to threaten him. Clear's throat, he insulted you," Nathaniel replied quietly. "I am entirely capable of handling an insult." "I know you are." Nathaniel shifted on the bench. "But you shouldn't have to." "Not alone." Josephine turned her head to look at him. The fading afternoon light caught the sharp lines of his jaw, the faint scar on his cheek from a rogue piece of slate. He was looking back at her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. There was no arrogance left, only respect, deep foundational respect. The carriage hit a rut in the muddy road, lurching violently. Josephine was thrown sideways. Nathaniel caught her arm, steadying her. His hand was warm, the calluses rough through the silk of her sleeve. He didn't let go immediately. This time, Josephine didn't pull away. They sat in the swaying carriage, the silence between them no longer a weapon, but a bridge. Spring arrived at Ashbourne Manor, not with a gentle unfurling of petals, but with a violent explosion of mud noise and grueling labor. The frost retreated, leaving the fields waterlogged and desperate for seed. The quiet, isolated survival of winter was replaced by the frantic energy of the planting season. The estate swelled with seasonal workers. Dozens of men and women from the neighboring village trudged up the long drive every morning, dragging plows, carrying sacks of lime, and leading heavy draft horses. Josephine no longer spent her days isolated in her office. She was out in the muck with them. She wore a heavy canvas apron over her dark wool dresses, a pair of thick leather boots on her feet, and a wide-brimmed felt hat to keep the harsh April sun off her neck. She stood by the wage tables, counting out shillings for the day laborers, checking off names in her increasingly battered ledger. She knew the names of the men digging the irrigation trenches. She knew whose wives were expecting, whose children had survived the winter cough, and who was prone to drinking their wages before Friday. She was no longer the imposing, terrifying bride from the city. She was the anchor of the valley. Nathaniel was beside her. The transformation that had begun in the freezing darkness of the stables was now complete. The soft, arrogant aristocrat was dead. In his place stood a man whose face was tanned and weathered, whose shoulders had broadened from heavy lifting, and who spoke with the quiet, measured authority of someone who knew exactly how much sweat a shilling was worth. He rode the property lines from dawn until dusk. He fixed broken wagon axles. He delivered fodder in the middle of the night. He did not ask for recognition, and he did not complain. Their relationship had settled into an efficient, silent rhythm. They anticipated each other's needs without asking. If Josephine was up late calculating payroll, Nathaniel would appear with a plate of sliced cold roast and cheese, leave it on her desk, and quietly tend the fire before departing. If Nathaniel returned from the field soaked to the bone from a sudden downpour, he would find dry clothes laid out on his bed and a hot bath waiting. It was an intimacy built entirely on utility. It was incredibly functional. It was also increasingly agonizing. The physical distance between them felt heavier as the weather grew warmer, the accidental brushes of their hands over a map, the shared glances across a crowded barn, the quiet moments standing together on the back terrace, watching the sun set over the newly ploughed fields. These small collisions sparked with an unspoken electrical tension. In late May, the annual sheep shearing concluded. It was a massive undertaking that yielded a record clip thanks to the upgraded winter sheds Josephine had financed. To mark the end of the grueling week, she authorized a modest celebration for the workers in the main barn. There was roasted pork, heavily spiced cider, and a local fiddler hired from Oak Haven. Josephine stood near the open barn doors, watching the festivities. The air was thick with the smell of lanolin wood-masted meat. She held a mug of cider, feeling the deep, bone-weary satisfaction of a job finished and paid for. Nathaniel walked over and leaned against the wooden doorframe beside her. He was wearing a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with faded white scars from winter labor. He held a tin cup of water. He had stopped drinking alcohol entirely in February. Coft says the wool buyer from Leeds will be here Tuesday, Nathaniel said, looking out at the dancing crowd. He expects a premium price for the fleece. The staple is incredibly strong this year. The sheep were properly fed, Josephine replied. Starvation produces weak wool. It's a simple equation. Nathaniel turned his head to look at her. The lantern light caught the sharp angle of his jaw. You saved them. You saved all of this. We saved it. She corrected quietly. I balanced the books. You kept the roof from caving in and the herd from freezing. He was quiet for a long moment. The lively music of the fiddle seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of his steady breathing. I bought you something, he said suddenly. His voice was lower, rougher. Josephine turned to him, surprised. He reached into his deep canvas pocket and pulled out an object wrapped in brown paper. He held it out. She took it cautiously. She untied the twine and folded back the paper. Inside was a heavy custom-made leather ledger cover. It was crafted from thick, supple ox-blood leather reinforced with hammered brass corners. Engraved into the center of the front cover in clean, unpretentious lettering were the words J. Ashbourne, Proprietor. Josephine stared at it. It wasn't a necklace. It wasn't a bouquet of house flowers. It was a tool. It was an acknowledgement of exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever given her. Your old one was falling apart, Nathaniel muttered, suddenly sounding unsure of himself, misinterpreting her silence. The binding was cracking. I noticed it when we were in Oak Haven. I had the saddle maker put it together. Josephine traced the embossed letters with her thumb. Her throat felt tight. It is perfect, Nathaniel. Thank you. He didn't step back. He stepped closer. The space between them vanished. She could smell the soap on his skin, the clean sweat of a day's work, the faint scent of rain. Josephine, he said her name, a quiet plea. She looked up. His eyes were entirely stripped of defenses. The cynical bored lord was gone. The man looking at her was hungry, grounded, and intensely focused. He raised his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently resting his callous palm against her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the warmth of his hand, letting her eyes flutter shut for a brief moment. A shudder ran through his jaw. He stepped in his other arm, wrapping securely around the small of her back, pulling her flush against his chest. It was not a tentative embrace. It was a claim. When he kissed her, there was no hesitation. It was deep, desperate, and heavily rooted in the months of shared survival. It tasted like cider and the metallic tang of unspoken apologies. Josephine dropped her hands, her fingers catching in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself against the solid wall of his chest. They stood in the shadows of the barn doors, the chaotic celebration continuing behind them, completely oblivious to the fact that the master and mistress of Ashbourne had finally found each other. The fragile, named peace of the estate was shattered 3 days later by the arrival of a massive, heavily gilded carriage bearing the crest of Wallace Cole. Josephine's father was a man built entirely of sharp angles and ruthless forward momentum. He was a titan of industry who viewed the world strictly through the lens of profit and loss. He had bought Nathaniel's debts and secured the marriage for one simple reason. He wanted a peerage for his bloodline. He expected his daughter to be presiding over high teas and managing an army of servants in pristine silk gowns. When the carriage halted on the gravel drive, Wallace stepped out, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane. His sharp eyes scanned the manor. The rotting trim had been replaced. The slate roof was whole. The grounds were meticulously kept, though devoid of the ornamental peacocks and useless statues he associated with the aristocracy. Josephine walked out to meet him. She was wearing a practical grey-day dress. She had ink on her fingers. "Father," she said, her voice even. She did not offer an embrace. The Coles did not do embraces. Wallace frowned, looking her up and down. "You look like a governess, Josephine. Where is your husband?" "Sleeping off a bender in the West Wing. I heard a rumor at the club that his London friends haven't seen him in months. I assumed he was dead or in Dee's prison. Nathaniel is at the lumber mill." Josephine replied smoothly, ignoring the insult. "We are auditing the timber yields for the southern acreage. Shall we go inside?" Wallace scoffed, following her into the foyer. "Auditing? Don't play games with me, girl. I paid good money for this estate to ensure you lived like a lady, not a clerk. I demand to see the accounts. If that useless lord has burned through the capital, I will strip this house to the studs and sell it for firewood." He marched into her office and took a seat in the leather armchair opposite the desk. He expected her to flinch, to panic, to produce a series of cooked books detailing Nathaniel's gambling losses and mistress fees. Josephine didn't flinch. She sat behind her desk, pulled out the heavy blood leather ledger Nathaniel had given her, and opened it flat. "The accounts are open for your inspection, Father," she said calmly. For the next hour, Wallace Cole scrutinized the numbers. He tracked the expenses. He saw the brutally efficient cuts to luxury items. He saw the heavy investments in infrastructure, seed and livestock. He saw the profit margins on the spring wool clip and the renegotiated coal contracts. He saw the complete absence of personal allowances drawn by the master of the house. The silence in the room grew heavy. Wallace flipped back to the index, his brow furrowed. He was looking for the flaw. He was looking for the leak. "This is impossible," Wallace muttered, tracing a line of red ink. "The operating costs are down 40%. The agricultural yields have doubled." "Who is managing your workforce? Who did you hire?" "We didn't hire anyone," a voice said from the doorway. Wallace's head snapped up. Nathaniel stood in the threshold. He was wearing canvas trousers and heavy boots crusted with dried mud. Sawdust clung to his shoulders. He looked rugged, exhausted, and incredibly dangerous. He did not look like a man who could be bought. Nathaniel walked into the room, crossing over to stand directly behind Josephine's chair. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on her shoulder. The gesture was casually possessive, completely solid. Josephine reached up and rested her fingers over his. "I manage the men, Mr. Cole," Nathaniel said, his voice flat and unapologetic. "Josephine manages the capital. We run the estate together." Wallace stared at the hand on his daughter's shoulder. He looked at the thick yellow calluses on Nathaniel's knuckles. He looked at the sawdust. He looked at the ledger. "You," Wallace sneered, though it lacked its usual venom. "The last time I saw you, you were crying over a roulette wheel in Mayfair, begging me to float your vowels." Nathaniel didn't blink. He didn't flush with shame. He simply held the older man's gaze with the cold, immovable weight of a mountain. "That man is dead," Nathaniel said quietly. "He died last autumn. If you have a problem with how this estate is run, you can take it up with the proprietor." He nodded down at Josephine. "But if you have come to insult my wife or to question her authority in her own home, you can get back in your carriage." Wallace Cole gripped his cane. He was a bully who thrived on fear. But looking at the two of them, the brilliant icy daughter he had underestimated and the broken aristocrat who had somehow forged himself into a weapon, he realized he had absolutely no leverage here. They did not need his money. They did not need his approval. They had built a fortress, and he was just a visitor. Wallace closed the ledger. He stood up slowly. "The numbers are sound," he said, his voice tight. It was the closest thing to a compliment he was capable of delivering. He looked at Nathaniel one last time, a flicker of begrudging respect in his cold eyes. Keep the roof tight, Ashbourne. I will expect a return on my investment by Christmas. You will have it, Josephine said. Wallace nodded sharply, turned, and walked out. They listened to the heavy thud of his cane against the floorboards, the slamming of the front doors, and the crunch of carriage wheels fading down the drive. When the house was entirely quiet again, Nathaniel exhaled a long breath. He looked down at Josephine. He's a charming man. Nathaniel deadpanned. Josephine laughed, a real genuine sound that startled them both. She leaned back in her chair, looking up at him. He's a monster, she agreed, but he knows a good ledger when he sees one. Nathaniel moved around the desk. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her up from the chair and wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He smelled like sawdust and pine. Josephine held him tightly, closing her eyes, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against hers. The past was gone. The audit was over. They belonged exactly where they were. September brought the harvest, and with it a bone-deep exhaustion that settled over the valley like a heavy woolen blanket. The air was thick with the golden, dust-threshed wheat, and the sharp, sweet smell of rotting apples in the orchards. For 3 weeks, the manor operated at a fever pitch. When the final cart rolled out of the yard, heavily laden and bound for the rail station, a profound stillness fell over Ashbourne. The war was over. They had won. Josephine sat in her office, watching the dust mows dance in the late afternoon sun. The ox-blood ledger lay open on her desk. The numbers were staggering. They had not only cleared the remaining operational debts, but they had turned a profit large enough to begin investing in a second mill downriver. She closed the book. The heavy thud of the leather cover echoed in the quiet room, sounding incredibly final. It was exactly 1 year to the day since she had arrived at Ashbourne Manor. The door clicked open. Nathaniel stepped inside. He did not wear a velvet smoking jacket. He wore a clean, simple linen shirt and dark trousers. His skin was deeply tanned from the summer sun, and his hands were permanently etched with the topography of hard labor. He looked at her, his eyes dark and entirely focused. "The men are paid," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Croft locked the lower barns. "The estate is secure." "The accounts are balanced," Josephine replied. She rested her hands on top of the closed ledger. They looked at each other across the room. The silence between them was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a shared language. It was the heavy, comfortable quiet of two people who had pulled a dying thing out of the mud and breathed life back into it together. Nathaniel walked across the room. He didn't stop at the edge of the desk. He walked around it, extending his hand. "Come upstairs," he said. Josephine looked at his hand, the thick calluses, the faded white scar across his knuckles. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, and completely possessive. He didn't lead her toward the blue room. He walked her past the grand staircase, landing down the wide corridor, and pushed open the heavy double doors of the master suite. It was a massive room anchored by a towering four-poster bed draped in dark, heavy linen. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, throwing warm, flickering light against the oak-paneled walls. The room smelled of cedar wood smoke and rain. It was his room. He was inviting her into the absolute center of his life. He closed the doors behind them. The heavy latch fell into place with a definitive click. Nathaniel turned to her. He didn't offer flowery declarations. He didn't beg for forgiveness for the man he had been a year ago. That man was dead, buried under 12 months of dirt, sweat, and mutual survival. He reached out and pulled the pins from her hair. He did it slowly, deliberately, letting the heavy, dark strands fall around her shoulders. His fingers brushed against the nape of her neck, sending a sharp shiver down her spine. Josephine tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. "You are my wife," he whispered, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet of the room. It wasn't a legal statement. It was a vow, the first real vow he had ever made to her. "I am," she answered. He kissed her. There was nothing tentative about it. It was a collision. He tasted like smoke and black tea. Josephine wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. feeling the hard, lean muscle of his back under his shirt. The polite, measured restraint they had maintained for a year shattered completely. He backed her toward the bed, his hands moving urgently over her clothes, discarding the heavy wool and stiff cotton. He wasn't gentle, but he was entirely devoted. When they fell onto the mattress, the cold, cynical reality of their arranged marriage dissolved, replaced by the hot, undeniable truth of their earned intimacy. He mapped the lines of her body with his calloused hands, treating her not as a fragile porcelain doll, but as an equal force of nature. She grounded him. He consumed her. They moved together with the same violent necessary rhythm that had defined their survival of the winter. It was raw. It was desperate. It was entirely theirs. The next morning, Josephine woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window panes. She opened her eyes. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The heavy linen sheets were tangled around her legs. She wasn't alone. Nathaniel was lying beside her, awake, watching her in the dim grey light. He was resting on his side, his head propped on his hand. He didn't look away when she caught him staring. He reached out, tracing the line of her jaw with a rough thumb. "Good morning," he said softly. Josephine smiled. A slow, deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She shifted closer, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, enduring beat of his heart. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The house was hers, the land was hers, and the man holding her was entirely, irreversibly hers. True power doesn't announce itself with a scream. It builds quietly in the dark until it is undeniable. Josephine and Nathaniel's journey from a cold transactional arrangement to an unbreakable partnership proves that respect cannot be bought. It must be earned in the dirt, the ledgers, and the daily grind of survival. If this story of quiet vengeance, hard work, and grounded romance kept you captivated, please hit that like button and share the video with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deeply human historical drama. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Josephine's revenge?